Hello and welcome to the Patent Literacy Symposium. In this session, Power Up Storybook Reading, Engage in Purposeful and Interactive Read-Alouds. My name is Andrea Bell and I am joined by my colleague Kim Jenkins. We are excited to facilitate this session for everyone. Before we start, we've got those housekeeping items to review. You can access the presenter handouts for this session, the presenter bio, and the conference schedule on the Patent website, and the link will be provided in the chat. Just a reminder, this session will be recorded and is 75 minutes in length, which will include some question answers at the end and possibly throughout. To access closed captioning, click on the icon CC Live Transcript on the Zoom control panel. If you experience any technological difficulties, please go to the Technical Support Guides area above the schedule on the symposium page. Because this is a webinar, microphones have been muted and your video feature has been turned off. We would love for you to tweet out or share out on social media all that you are learning from the symposium. The hashtag for the symposium is #PatentLit2022. And now I'm honored to introduce you to Lynn Kuhn.
Well, thank you, everyone. It is an honor and a pleasure to be able to share this session with you. I thought that I might go ahead and have a poll released and just have a sense of who's with us today. Your information's coming in fast and furious. I appreciate seeing the range from preschool through the connections in the primary and intermediate, and also welcoming instructional coaches, administrators. Greatly appreciate that. And I think we also have a couple higher ed folks. And in the chat, I see some kindred spirits. I see a number of SLPs, and you probably see that also in my connection on the screen as well. So welcome. It's always a pleasure to include you into such a powerful and important set of work in the domain of language. So thank you, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. Gave me a little bit of a sense of the richness that's with us today. So thank you. Well, let us go ahead and get started. My journey in this area has been rich and deep. I was fortunate as I was continuing to really develop my understanding related to the connections around this topic. I was fortunate to be engaged with a district in the state of Colorado, which is where I'm also from. They were awarded a federal early reading first grant. And over those 3 years, we really dove much more deeply into the tenets of course, oral language and phonological awareness and print knowledge. But woven into so much of our work was the incorporation of using children's literature. And what evolved as we transitioned into our second and third year within, and we were refining our practices within our early childhood centers, and the kindergarten teachers started to share that they were experiencing this positive change in how well their incoming kindergarten students were providing conversation and participating in read-alouds, and what were we doing special. And so from that, we decided that it would really be advantageous if we could expand the topic of read-alouds from our early childhood centers into our primary grades. And that is what we moved into. And so today, what I hope to share is a set of strategies that we developed to really encourage and increase active listening, spark questions, promote, extend conversations. And our discussions are really guided by then enriching purposeful talk, and that we started to continue to see how those experiences became such a key in leading students through those elementary grades and really developing the successfulness of becoming readers and writers. So let me go ahead and continue our journey into the content. And from there, One of the things that I truly believe interactive reading provides is building oral language and literacy. As we think about reading aloud to and with children, it's truly it's an engaging experience, and it enriches so many different purposes that we provide as learners, as well as adults guiding the learning of so many of the children that we support. And so as we can see here, some of the session topics that I'm going to weave in is definitely the importance of fostering language development, story comprehension, leading us to early literacy skills. And within multiple reads, the ability to cultivate vocabulary development, the importance of content knowledge, the exposures and the complexities of sentence structure, and just the nuances of language. So as we spend our short time together, I hope that I will engage ways to build active listening, how to think about sparking questions, and how to promote and extend conversations. Because so much of what we do is surrounded by talk. But how do we build that curiosity about the world and the love of reading along with that process? So as we're thinking about that, we have the opportunity to embrace read alouds in the way that it builds knowledge of the world, of language, of words, of text structure, of comprehension strategies. And I think about those journeys to faraway lands and motivating them to learn and explore. And I think Jeffrey Wilhelm really points out this well. The most important thing we can teach our children is how to learn. Vygotsky says moves us in the direction of weaving the importance of teaching reading. So as we think about those effective tools, what do they provide? Well, research is continuing to validate that the links between the science of reading and implementation are such a key part of what I'm hopefully sharing with you today. And as we think about all the work that Patton has built around the work of Hollis Scarborough and the reading rope, the areas of word recognition are really woven in with the strands of language comprehension. We focus on vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, using different text structures and genres. So it's not one layer, but it's multiple layers that are woven together during a read aloud. I'd like to share just a partial little clip here of some work that's happening in the Cincinnati Children's Hospital area. It is led by the neural imaging work that Dr. John Hutton has been doing, who's a pediatric neurologist. And he shows that children who are read to are activating receptive and expressive areas of speech and language far more than many other children that they're incorporating into their projects. And I think we all validate that the gap begins with language and conceptual concepts and development. So as we think about that, let's look at how the brain network works.
Learning to read is an amazing process. But did you know that children aren't born with a reading network? Instead, one has to be built through practice, where brain areas are trained to work together. This video shows how this happens. Language and reading mostly involve the left side of the brain, shown here. The area in the back, highlighted in blue, helps with seeing and imagining pictures and scenes. In red is a visual area specialized for shapes and objects, including letters and words. The area in orange processes word sounds, such as rhymes or phonics. It helps children learn to decode letters and words as they learn to read. The areas in green help understand what words and stories mean by combining them with pictures, imagination, and feelings. An area near the top of the brain, in yellow, helps pay attention to stories when listening or reading. This special part of the brain in the back, called the cerebellum, helps to learn new skills, including language and reading, like a turbocharger on a car. Brain areas on the surface are connected by bundles of nerve fibers, like wiring in a computer. These grow stronger and faster with practice, such as listening to stories and talking about them. The bundle in red connects language areas involved with sounds and meaning. The bundle in green connects areas involved with reading quickly and connecting words with feelings. The bundle in blue connects areas involved with seeing, imagination, and meaning. Now that we've seen how a child's brain is wired for reading, how can we help?
So how can we help? How can we build that journey? How can we incorporate the process that you are observing in that short video clip? And so as we think about that, at the end, I'll go ahead and I believe at that point, I should be able to provide you with the link to the video clip. And hopefully that will happen. So I will support that shortly. So one of the things that I think you experienced when you saw that short video clip was all that goes on in our little children's brains as they're accessing the language of books. And so I began some of our work with the team with the information that Nell Duke and Megan Shedd have provided, where they really started to extend their research to practice on what it takes. What are the tools to make a successful read aloud become a productive tool within our classroom environments? And so much of what I think we all continuously realize is the importance of purposeful preparation, that careful attention to details, how we select a book that's engaging, that's culturally relevant. And one of the things that we learned over time was the art of developing questions is a skill that requires a lot of thought and discussion, even within our colleagues, so that we're able to look at all the various opportunities that we can bring to the surface when we're working with a story. The way we listen to their responses as we start reading, as we pose questions, the conversations that they're having to maximize those interactions, and be able to glean what it is that they're taking away from that story. So we became really intentional in how we start to understand and how do we create literal, factual questions, how we lead to the importance of generating ways to guide them in the content of the story, and giving them opportunities to make predictions, generalizations beyond that story. So what we found is one of the key tenets was thinking about what does it mean to create a question? And in that conjunction, how do we actively develop their thinking? Well, that journey was started by how to make decisions on purposefully planning that structure and how to choose books. And so there were a number of different opportunities and different factors that we brought into the connection. So selecting books invites your children into the story. Choosing those books, reflecting on the diversity, the values, the interests of our students, and to think about how books could serve many different purposes, many different reinforcements of concepts, the idea of schema, the importance of choosing words, and even the importance of thinking about the letter sound knowledge or rhyme that supports us in phonological awareness. All of those layers can be actively opened up, and then to lead them into the writing process. One of the things we found for schema was actually pairing narrative with informational text, evolving around the same theme. So part of the goal was to capture their attention, encourage them to want to read that book again, to ask that added question that hadn't been provided in that beginning stage, and that they want to learn more, and their curiosity gets generated through that process. So we used a couple different authors, and they're in the reference section as well. Our readings came from Schickendans, McKee, Collins, where they really provided us, as we were developing our read alouds, to create a roadmap or a guide as we developed all of the thinkings that go into multiple reads. And as we did this, I'm going to have the opportunity with you to think about how we choose vocabulary words, how we understand what will be a key to building their interest to come into the book, how we can create questions that have that gradual release, how we decide when to pause, when to talk, following the lead of the child in that conjunction of discussions. So what do we mean by a word? So much of a book is about words, right? But the reality is in that preparation of a text, we had to identify which vocabulary words for the group of students that we're working with are a balance of unfamiliarity and are worthwhile to learn. So it's a balancing act. Another layer, we started asking ourselves if some of the words can go beyond the story to be included in other parts of the day. We know Laura Justice studies this quite extensively, and she says the more you hear a word read to you and used in other contexts, there's a better chance that our children are going to own those words. It really tapped into the seminal study of Hart and Risley as they focused on the amount of ongoing exposure of words and how they correlate with academic success. Another person that really generated our thinking was the work of Vygotsky, who actually coined the word inner speech. And he coined it as a verbalized thought. And as you continue to deepen our practice and we think about where have our psychologists or linguists come to relate to this term inner speech. And it is really how we think we use words and how those words develop our own concepts and meanings. So within that journey, we found that we leaned towards the work of Isabel Beck and her team. And I'm sure many of us are quite familiar around the importance of selecting vocabulary words. But the work that they framed around the choice was critically helpful for us. So as we started to highlight those new and unique words that potentially students are going to encounter and read alouds, we had to think about how the children would apply those words. How do we extend from the text to other settings? So we really felt that our goal was to deepen their understanding of the words and to develop transference of those words in their oral and in their written language. So I'd like to sort of tap into something that I heard many years ago by Stephen Stahl, where he likened the idea of choosing words like a story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. How can we focus on selecting words that will increase the students' word knowledge? Well, to do that, he ended up thinking about the usefulness of choice and to think about that word that you want to access and how those words can relate to ideas or themes, how we can connect those vocabulary words with new words, and then how to make those decisions of building the usefulness of that word into other environments, into other contexts. So for example, we could choose words that were specific to the focus on the characters of the story. We could think about having words that are fun to say, you know, and huff, puff, chinny, chin, chin, and your prosody changes as you're saying those lovely words, and they're chiming in saying those words. But we can also include problem-solving words like predict, enough, compare. And we also know just the basics of introducing a book and introducing literacy words, the author, the title, the illustrator. So as we think about that, one of the things that we generated by our readings was how do we make a structure that has a routine, and also to validate that so many of our children, when we're reading beautiful children's literature books, have way more vocabulary words that our children need to be exposed to in a fast mapping environment. But then we're also going to have to think about which vocabulary words are critical to understanding the text at that point in time. And so part of what we developed was the opportunity to think about a strategy that we called PAT. So I'm going to do a quick, see if I can move this through and tap it incrementally. So the first thing that we looked at in the definition of PAT was pointing to the illustrations of objects in the book. If there was something that visually we could connect the word to, was going to be an advantage. They could be illustrations, objects within the text. Then we looked at the act of acting out a meaning of a word with a movement or a gesture, changing our voice, our pacing, even having realia to show and assist. So many of our students could then manipulate the meanings of those words from a three-dimensional perspective. We could use that idea when we changed our voice, when we thought about words, suspicious, grumpy, spooky. Those were demonstrations that allowed them to build connections. And then we had the ability to narrow our choice. We knew that there would be words that we would have to create student-friendly definitions so that we built meaning that was purposeful, that would be connected to making sense of the story that they were reading, and to see whether it would apply to other environments that they continuously are connected to. So sometimes we avoid doing something, and that might be a character trait that was happening within the story. So that might be a word where we might say avoid, and then we might say, you know, it's someone who wants to avoid something. They try to keep it away from it, keep it from happening. So even that nuance of truncating, but making that meaning purposeful. And to do that, then we don't have the onus of trying to teach all the words that they may not have a connection to, but that can still keep the flow of the story. And that's a balance during a read aloud that we have to intentionally think about. So what we're going to look at now, of course, is the art of questioning. And I do see it as an art, because as we think about the importance of asking questions during read alouds, we have to create also the importance that questions are tools. I think Hunkins really says it well. They're tools for both information seeking and information processing. So how can we consciously form questions that elicit longer, more thoughtful responses by and with our children? And then having our children delve into the comprehension, the understanding of the text. So how can we encourage them to then provide answers? Some of those answers might be in a word or a phrase. And then how do we craft those answers? Do we provide them by restating their answers? Do we frame it with more specific vocabulary words from the book? So many different wonders happen. And the quality of the design of questions really is intentional, from ask, answer, evidence. How do we cycle through that process? I think Walsh and Sadie's does a really nice job in their text, quality questioning, that really facilitated the work that we were doing. So as we continue, one of the questions I challenge the teachers with is that questioning is not just going to happen at the end of the book, but it's actually going to lead us into a conversation with the book. We sometimes framed it that we want to bring students along on their journey. We wanted to think about how do we build those questions to connect to a big idea, an enduring understanding. How do we want to set the stage? How do we want to then support framing their answers throughout the story? And the importance of remembering. And this was huge. You may find that they're not getting that correct response that you wanted, but that's okay, because it gave you insight to where they are in understanding what the book is sharing, what the author's intent of the book is, and where you wanted them to go within that book, and use that as a guide. So one of the tools that we used was a sharing hand. And some of you may have a fair amount of familiarity with this from different venues and opportunities that you also do. We created garden gloves, and we allowed us to go ahead. And as you can see here, we actually created a little Velcro. So we didn't have to have all the questions visible, but we also could understand we had a large population of Spanish speakers. So we actually put both the English and the Spanish word, and we also included icons. Again, that imagery of connection. And we started always with who did what, the frame of what a question and an answer is. And then as it evolved in the reading of that story, we may then include, of course, the when does it take place, the where, the why, how. So we found that as we created these sharing hands, one of the gifts that we ended up providing is building a routine. So as the children understood how questions are interactions with their thinking, we then brought our families in. And we told the kindergarten teachers, if you model this over and over, they're going to understand what a question is and how to respond to questions and how that transference and creating first grade, second grade connections in that design. We also talked about 2 different platforms. You can have dry questions, you can have juicy questions, both being critically beneficial in developing thinking. So as we think about dry questions, we're helping students listen carefully, focus on the facts, the details within the story. We could even as simply pose, what color was the girl's dress? Or what does Little Red Riding Hood find on the ground? Oh, that's right, some grains of wheat. Or what materials did the 3rd pig use to make his house? Thinking, bricks, someone said, right. So the 3rd pig used bricks to make his house. Who was the 3rd animal that the old lady swallowed? Now we get that repetition, that sequencing. Then we look at juicy questions, and that really provides more opportunities to think beyond, to experiment with language, and having them partake in, what would you do if you were Goldilocks and you broke Little Bear's chair? Or perhaps, should Jack have taken the things from the giant? And then they might say yes, or they might say no, and that we're ready to say, why do you think that's true? Or why not? So when we keep looking at the guiding practices of generating questions, the art that it takes to do that is enormous. And it's a comfort of the importance of listening to the children's responses. We can't be thinking of something else because we miss those opportunities of tapping into their language and thinking about those as guiding opportunities for us. Even from an assessment perspective, it's a progress monitoring tool. Listening, responding, see how they then could enhance their response, clarify their answers. So one of the things that we really needed to emphasize was think time. We tend to want to jump in so quickly, but it's really important that we have to train ourselves to pause, generally about 3 to 5 seconds before either calling on a student or providing feedback. But it takes a purposeful thought of figuring out, how do I want to pause? How do I want to give that support? So we engaged in thinking about this process in multiple different ways. And so we're going to address now in our thinking, in our learning today, of how we then take the words that we choose, the art of questioning, and then moving it into the structure for narrative stories today. And what I like to say is that we're bringing our students along on their journey through the book. We're wanting them to be engaged, to think. And so when we realized that it wasn't a natural progression that we own, we had to think of a structure, a plan to make that work. And so that's when we went into a lot more discussion and research and readings, and I provide a number of those in the reference section of the second handout. So how we began this idea of an interactive read aloud was work that McKee and Chickendance had provided for us as a platform to build from. We know that interactive read alouds, it's a research-based, systematic approach to reading through, which students become active participants in the process of thinking and comprehending. So this reading model started to evolve, and it allowed us to really think about having to take not just a single book, multiple books, but how to figure out how to couch a book with a series of guiding structures for anywhere from 3 to 4 reads. And then how we can take each subsequent read of the story and carry a fundamental purpose in order to increase their understanding. So what it required is that we had to model metacognition. We had to use our think alouds. We had to scaffold their comprehension. We had to think about, to pose and craft constructed, concrete and inferential questions. So part of doing that, we then realized one of the guiding supports during that first read is a big why question. So that at the end, we have something to challenge our thinking and to invite us into going back to the book again. And we also had to think about, where do we want to teach those vocabulary words? Do we want to do some pre-teaching of those? Do we want to build those during the 4 reads? How will those layers of the knowledge of the word help through that process? So the first read, we found that we gave an overarching sense of book, discussed unfamiliar words, led us into the idea of thinking and developing comprehension strategies, schema, the explicitness of that engaging process. The second read, we looked at it as working to construct the story. How do we lead them through the story a second time? One of the ways we might say is, let's go back and think about some clues that might have happened that we didn't pick up the first time. Great book to model that is, of course, Corduroy, and I'll show you that shortly. The third read is having students chime in on vocabulary or key concepts. So it's a gradual release of the teacher doing the predominance of the read of the book during the first read, and that gradual transition of bringing the students more involved into the story, participating more through that process. And each time we built that fundamental purpose to increase their understanding of the text. We then found we don't have to stop at third reads. We can do additional reads, but creating different ways to find the joy. What did they take from the book? And then how do we want to interact with them? So we had role playing, we had puppetry, we had sequencing of stories. There were a lot of different activities that we found were beneficial. So as we think about the researchers who've done such a heavy list of studying read alouds, and the importance concluded from that is that if we engage students in that process and we routinize those expectations, they actually become better listeners. They realize that they're a part of the process, the part of the thinking. It's not just the teacher doing the talk. They're a part of that journey. And that's such a key part. That, I think, was our biggest learning as we developed this process. And I believe that's what the kindergarten and then the first grade and second grade teachers started to realize as well. That reward the student as being a participant, a learner with you, was such a powerful opportunity to build upon. But we also knew that we had to create structure. We knew the importance of giving a frame of what your different responsibilities are going to be during the different reads. So in the first read, we give the children the overall sense of book. So part of that is the discussion of unfamiliar vocabulary words and comprehension. So they had 3 jobs that they needed to do during that first read. They had to listen and watch. The most prominent and concrete of all the executive functioning skills is that idea of listening and watching. And the third part is we want them to think as we're going through the story. The second read, we're going to now start releasing and having them work on constructing that story. So we changed a little bit of their responsibilities. So we had them remembering from the first read as we're going in to the second read of the story. They're still thinking, but we're also giving them an opportunity to share their ideas. The third read, we opened it up even further, and we would have them chiming in on vocabulary words as the book was read. So when we had targeted words from each week to week, we had also those words in pictures connected that they were close by to where we were sitting and reading, so children could access those words. Even if they couldn't read the words all the time, The image on the card gave them an opportunity to remember the words. So a lot more listening, thinking, and chiming in were their 3 responsibilities during the 3rd read. And then as we realized, and we got into other books, we found that a 4th read, a 5th read was as much an advantage. So now they're remembering through the week, they're acting out, they played different roles depending on what the different 4th read was going to build. They had to watch their friends, because not everybody was acting it out all the time. Not everybody was in the puppet show. And one can truly tell you the joy of having this structure made such a difference, because they had a role to play every day as we read a 1st read, a 2nd read, a 3rd read. So let's think about those nuances, all right? Think about and looks like. Those are the tenets, the purpose of how we created that 1st read. And as we read the work and learned information from Shiggins and Gee and Collins and many others, they always framed it, make it magical, invite them into the story. And so as we think about that and invite them, we know that there's an enjoyment. So to think about the characters, the relationships, the key events, what's important, what's the plot of the story, how to make the problem explicit. And then how do we connect when we do an opening? How do we want to use the cover of the story, the title, the illustrations? How much of it do we want to set first in motion versus perhaps those are going to be our 2nd or our 3rd read connections? So that was a huge part. How do we make it magical? How do we engage? How do we build that curiosity on some special recurring ideas that are broad but significant and really build a thread with the story that we're reading? So I just noticed, and I'll do a quick share, and we can certainly talk a little bit more. The visuals themselves were basically just clip art. So hopefully they're clear enough within the PowerPoint handout that you have that you can easily make those. I will share with you, they looked something like this, and I can put it under my dock camera so you can see a visual. So what we did is we created this and we put them in heavy duty sheet protectors. And so you can see that we created a 1st read, a 2nd read plan, then we moved to a 3rd, and then we went ahead and we did a 4th. And a little side note, what happened one day, I happened to be in one of the classrooms, and as the teacher got ready for the day and started reading, and she was on the 2nd read, but she forgot to make the change and she still had the 1st read template. And all of a sudden, one of the children piped up and said, wait a minute, we're on our 2nd read. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. Even just that routine of knowing where they are in their story and their day in reading. So what did we do to plan? And I'm not going to go extensively. I really created so many of these slides directly into your handout. So the purpose for the 1st read in our venue was to orientate the students to a story, a way to scaffold the understandings, the vocabulary, the characters, the plot. How do we want to engage them in the storytelling that's going to evolve in that 1st read? So of course, we made sure that we had a way to introduce the story, the vocabulary that we're going to be incorporating, maintaining that thread of understanding, and generating a big why question that we're going to follow up after we do our 1st read. So a couple examples. If I took corduroy, I would say, as a team, let's think about that. Read through that. What are you each generating? And then we came together, and it was so interesting to see there were a subset of words that everyone agreed upon. But then there were a few that we all had differences. And why did we have differences? Because we had different student groups. And different students have different layers that they bring into the story. So that process, does it make an importance to talk about an escalator. And it might, depending on your environment, where you live, what are the stores like? But we also thought about what are extension words: to wonder, to admire. Those are words that we can take beyond the story. And that was a key part as we move forward. So one of the questions is, do you define and introduce the vocabulary words before reading or as you encounter them in the book? And what I would tell you is that it happens in multiple ways. So we didn't want to control the entire environment. So depending on the groups of students that you're working with and the level of their language knowledge made a difference on the extent that we do pre-teaching of the words and how we build those words with the terminology of point, that point, act, tell scenario. So question options might be in corduroy. I might have, well, I wonder what will happen when he finds his button. So that leads then, oh, wait a minute. Do I remember that? Maybe not. So I've tapped into a wonder that I'm going to lead my second read as we come together again and say, remember at the end of the book, we were wondering what would happen when he finds his button? Let's go back in and read the second time. Maybe we can figure that part out. Or at the end of a second read, did any part of the story make you feel sad for corduroy? So now when we read a third time, we're tapping into emotions. So you can see the evolution of how questions can lead to the next part of thinking. So a couple things that evolved. So knowing that we look at the plan, we would do the following. We would analyze what are some character relationships that we want to think about, and we would tap that into our plan. We would also think about the second character in the story was Lisa, and what was Lisa's role within that story. The next part is the problem. So we might look at the book cover and we might say that Corduroy wants a home, but as we can see, he's not perfect. He's a missing button. Wonder what's going to happen. So perhaps we might think about it this way as we go into this wonderful book that I just love. Corduroy wants someone to buy him and take him home. But he's missing a button on his overalls. I wonder if he'll find that button. Maybe that will help him find a home. Can I go in the book and find out? That's the extent. I'm not overdoing. I'm really being concise with what I want to think about for my first read. And so from that point forward, we then move on and we engage in the story, and then we think about outcomes. What is it that we want to happen? What do we want to observe? We want to see if they are enjoying the book, of course. We want to develop their overall sense of book. And are they finding that to be the nuance that we're demonstrating? So we want to see their attention, their engagement. We want to see that continuous increase of their listening vocabulary. Is that happening in the story? We want to see whether they're following the thread of the main ideas, the characters. Have I set the stage to build their curiosity to go back to read that book again? So the way we plan out a first read is critically important when we think about what we're hoping to have as outcomes of that first read. Well, let's continue in our journey. And now the second read took on a different perspective. From now, we say, let's reconstruct. What are ways that will allow us to reconstruct that story, that engaging component to go back into a text? So we may have them now starting to chime in with the title or the author or a character. We also start transitioning in our planning on how we're going to create different questions. We also might find that we need to clarify a misperception or confusion. And we also know that we want to extend the thinking of the characters in that text and the plot line. So from that perspective, we might use taglines like, I wonder. So not giving them all the answers, but rather seeing what they're remembering as we reconstruct the story. And this is where we find we tend to now revisit vocabulary even a little bit more explicitly within the storyline. And we always want to have a discussion question ready to go at the end of that read. And you can see why it becomes so important to plan ahead, to have those nuances so that you're ready to be responsive. You're ready to actually see how well the students are getting involved with the story, being able to create those emotions, those connections with the characters as well. So what we needed to do is think about what are the tools that allow us to plan the second read. So we definitely had an introduction that linked to the day before's reading. The knowledge, we may have some leading questions that we want to form. We definitely want to be more attentive to a few of the vocabulary words that we initiated, using Pat as that support. We also know that during the read, we want to clarify points in the story that allow them to extend the why, the how of the sharing hand. And then we come back to that big question that we may have posed at the end of the first read. What connections do we make? What clues did we find out? Those are all going to be supportive to getting the students curious. So a point was requested here, the idea of can we read the story over 2 days or 4 days, or all 4 reads in 1 day? We actually did it across multiple days because we want them to digest the information. We even at other points in the day might say, oh, remember that character in that story? Are you feeling like that character today? Or something happened and they're sad or they're happy. So we might extend the work that we did in a more structured way during the first read, but we may incorporate that in other parts of the day as well when we're working with the students. But we found it advantageous that a read was happening multiple days, and that became a much more plausible structure. And it also led them to move from the reading of the story so we could build in the writing connection. So we might create prompts that we would then extend and have them in their writing journal be able to share a response, personalize a response to the character that we were talking about. What did that mean for them? How did they feel when that happened? If I lost a button, what did that mean? How does that feel? So as we think about that, we then realized what are the structures for reading a book the second time. So a way that we guided that in clarifying extended questions, we did words like yesterday we asked, well, why did Corduroy want to find his button so badly? Today, let's look if we can find clues that tell us about how Lisa feels about Corduroy. So again, setting the stage in inviting them back in the book, but giving them a purpose, what to look for, what to listen, what to remember. So that whole backtracking, clarifying, extending is such a key part in that second read. And then the idea that after reading, add another question. Well, why did Lisa bring Corduroy home, even though he was missing a button? So let's think about that. What was the evidence in the story that gave them some clues? What was it that they brought to the story? What's a real life situation for themselves about losing something but still being loved? Or do we want to look at this from a different perspective? Is this about building a friendship between Corduroy and Lisa? It never says the word friendship in the story itself. But is that the direction we want to go? So you can see the conversation that happened with our teachers from grade to grade, even thinking about this from another layer of importance. So one of the things that we always refer to is a progress monitoring process. What is it that you want to observe? What do you want to observe your students doing, thinking? So focusing on that understanding of the sequence of the story, the meaning of the story, was a key part. We wanted to see how well the students were participating, how they connected, predicted, retold certain segments. All of those are ways for us to monitor growth. And also to know where we might change the types of questions that we're going to generate. How much of the queries are contextually based, and how many will gradually build towards decontextualizing the language, where they start adding their thoughts and their reasons. It's a balancing act. It's not one or the other. It's one and. How do we infuse and how do we filter? Well, then we get to our third read. Well, now we changed it up a little bit, and we're going to have them be more involved in the reading of this story. So we had tapped into the word chiming in, building that expressive vocabulary connection with the words that we've been introducing, and then having them go ahead and fill in those words as we're reading the story. And then asking ourselves, what words would be beneficial for me to pause and see if they can chime in? So you can see how many different variables come into play. So we did tend to make little notations in our text. We might put a marker or a little tag so that we remember to pause, remember to know when to point, when do we change to acting it out, when do we create a student-friendly definition. All of those parts evolve as we're reading the story as the teacher, to making sure that we're following those steps and that we're always continuing our main focus. Think about Hollis Scarborough's reading rope, that language comprehension, the vocabulary. Where is it going to be important? The sentence structure. How is that influencing the meaning of the story? And how can they make connections? Sequencing events, cause-effect relationships, characters' motivations within the story. So many different layers open up for a third read. So one of the ways that we, of course, had a plan, and so with Corduroy, we had a quick introduction. We had them going ahead and recall, chiming in. We reconnected with some of the vocabulary words. And then during the reading, we wanted to make sure we were maintaining the thread of the story. Where would be good points to pause for them to chime in? Remember that 3 to 5 second, giving them a chance to process, to think of words they want to build in. And then, of course, at the end, how do we want to discuss those story elements? The sequencing. How do we want to include the characters in this story? Were there certain emotions we want to tap into? So as we think about that plan, it did require a lot of intentionality in the work that we needed to support. So as we're continuing, one of the questions, how I scheduled the time needed to complete this process with teachers. I think that's the $1 million question, right? We found that we started to identify a theme. We would generate a series of books that we wanted to use in our read alouds within that theme. And they all were a part of that decision tree as teams. But then we broke them up into pairs. So it works when you have more than one teacher per grade level, of course, that helps. And what we asked them to do when we created that planning template is for them each to take turns with the book. And then they created, and they could each try it out and then come back and reflect what worked well in that plan for this book and refine that. And then we had basically a share drive so that teachers could share different stories that they made decisions that they wanted to use within that theme for that 3, 4, 5 weeks of stories that they're going to be using. And there was that give and take that they could build on. A second grade teacher might find that there was a book that the first grade team used. They may go ahead and pull that. So it was a give and take through that process as we moved forward with this. So let's continue. I know our time runs short here, and I want to make sure I fill in some of these. So what are the planning during a third read? It's about now, how do we help students reason? How do we help them learn to make predictions? How do we think about creating some solutions? So that idea of problem solving within the storyline. So we have language to work with, but now we can have them start to take the concrete and to start decontextualizing, and how do we bring them into the story? How do they go beyond the story? So many different things that happen. So we might say, well, this week we've talked about how Corduroy was not perfect because he was missing a button, but that Lisa loved him anyway. Lisa got to bring him home. So today, as we read, I want you to help me read the story a little bit more. I want you to chime in with ideas, with words you know. So one of the ways that we helped generate vocabulary is we created file folders. And so we identified vocabulary words that we were working on that would assist in this third read. And they had it by their tables, or if they were sitting on the floor listening to the story. So they had a place to grab language from, so to speak. And then after reading, we thought about what could we build as extension? What toy or stuffed animal do you love so much? It may have a broken part. Will you still love it? Why? Why not? And have them do oral language partner shares. And then we can invite them into their journal writing. So you can see the various extensions for reading and writing that evolved as we were moving forward. Well, here's the fourth read. And this was really our way of saying, okay, let's make it exciting. How can we dramatize the story in another direction? Could we create art projects, dramatic play, flannel boards? There's so many possibilities that can happen. The idea was that we wanted to make sure that we were connecting back to characters with that role playing and having them use their words to be a part of the description and the retell, and encouraging them to be storytellers. Isn't that a special gift? We miss out so often. We think about our children and the homes that they come from, and how we so wish that the elders will tell the stories to carry on. Well, we're doing that as well in a read-aloud, and we're expanding their language. We can do that through flannel boards, picture sequencing, summarization, and even the ability to use their words. And that's where that follow-up of comprehension comes into play. How well are they beginning to own those words? How many times do they have to hear the word, speak the word, make those phonological representations within that word? Numerous times. Isabel Beck will sometimes say you need 12, 14 opportunities to really develop ownership, not in a drill and kill kind of scenario, but purposefully engaging them in those words. So I left you in this last few slides here just with a couple other templates that I think we find very familiar to us when we think about retells. And so these are some highlights of story elements that we so often think about. And this is what the teachers brought to the table initially. When we thought about how do we construct multiple reads? How do we make it powerful? How do we incorporate engagement? So many of them said, well, of course we can use story elements. I said, okay, start from that vantage point. Think about how you want to be focused, purposeful. So we could look at it from this vantage point. So I had them say, okay, let's say we did Jack and the Beanstalk. What type of questions would you generate for each of the elements of setting, problems, goals, endings? We then also crafted as a tool, and I know this is a little bit tiny, hopefully it'll be visible for you in your handout, but just what does the title tell the reader about the story? So we then generated added questions that we could weave into our plans. What I found, and I don't know if this resonates for many of you, the fact that you can't always think on your feet. Having structured supports is a gift, and our teachers found that to be the case as well. So as you can see here, I gave you some suggestions of queries for setting, character, problem turning point in the resolution, that rising action, and then that turning point. And what did we want to come away with? What did we learn from that story? Would we recommend that story to a friend? And isn't this a great way to start creating writing prompts for them to go and decontextualize their language from another vantage point, not only from the oral conversation, but also from the written perspective. And so as we think about that, I hope that in our time together, I was able to give you the opportunity to value the importance of multiple reads, to engage children in cognitively challenging book talk, to think about cause and effect relationships, predictions, analyzing the characters, their feelings. So often children have a hard time expressing their feelings, but they can relate to a character and they can use the conversation through the character and how that relates to them. It's a safe net for them to feel comfortable. But the first read we started was very literal. Later, we build in that pondering, those inference-making connections. We moved from vocabulary being receptively taken to then using those words expressively. We also transition from that first read where they're more passive and they're taking in the story. And then gradually in that second, third, fourth, fifth read even at times, they become more active in that process. I hope what I shared with you, don't just question for question's sake. Encourage your students to ask questions as well as you're moving along. There might be something that they've really hooked into that they want clarity. They have permission. We want them to understand the art of questioning as well. And the value that the goal is not to get to the right answer. The goal is to think. I think about one of the premises way back when Common Core was really focused on finding the evidence. I think that's really a part of what we do with read alouds. In that second, that third, fourth read, we want them to go back. What's something that really resonated for you? Making sure that they make those connections. Read alouds have such a joy. It ignites imagination. It ignites curiosity if we do it well. It's not just about remembering that book. It's getting to think about that book. Are we teaching metacognition in a read aloud? Totally. Ready, set, go. That action of reading a book. The importance that it's the talk that surrounds the storybook reading. That's what gives us the power, the joy. Being able to look at similarities, differences, wonders, challenging their thinking, building units of study around books. I can use fiction, poetry, and what was happening that we really had to design, and it's a much heavier lift sometimes, is how do we do a multiple read, or how do we move each chapter with nonfiction informational text that still looks at some of these very important components of a book, but it took another layer of discussion, and that's for another time. But know that choosing and reading books with the goal of what we want them to be a part of is key. So I'd like to do two things as we're closing out our time together. I don't know if you're familiar with the World Read Aloud Day process. It really was an opportunity over probably a decade or so ago that World Read Aloud became a worldwide movement. And it's actually now celebrated in all of our states and actually across the globe. And reading aloud really is the importance and the power of how it can impact children's learning in their lives, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their life circumstances. And that's the joy of what's provided. So let me have you celebrate the power of words with this short clip.
We are the living. We won't be broken. It's our time to stand up for ourselves. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Sometimes we dream, and what we can't believe, everything seems shelter from the pain. All the love I wanna give's in the hands of life I'm trying to live. Oh, we are the living. We won't be taken. It's our time to stand up. We are the living. We won't be taken. It's our time to stand up for ourselves. Whoa, whoa,
Apologize, I'm not quite sure what was going on, but I think you got the message and the beauty and the importance of celebrating the power of words and read alouds. And so I would end with a couple quotes that I think are so pertinent to our short time together and to embrace the love of reading. I think as we read, the first understanding and skills essential for reading success truly appears when we read aloud with our children. And we think about all the places you'll go. Dr. Seuss certainly said it well, right, in the book. And the more you read, the more things you'll know, the more you learn, the more places you'll go. Few children learn to love books by themselves. Part of that is the journey that we can build with them through the written word, through oral to written connections. And so I saw in the chat, we had some colleagues who were asking about resources, and I did add a second handout, and it allowed you then to see a couple different ways that you can use some of these resources that we found very helpful in the work that we did. So one is a template that we created for interactive read alouds. And you can see here that we differentiated first reads and moving to the outcomes and the progress monitoring structure. We also created a template that looked at before, during, and after, and how we looked at it across the 3 different reads. From there, we also found a document that allowed us to look at, again, text-dependent questions across different layers of text, as well as my providing you a reference of some of the readings that we used to prepare ourselves in designing this structure. And the last part of my added handout was to show you how we took a book, the Tacky the Penguin, some of you may know that, but what you can see here is we created a visual structure of character, problem, purpose. We identified a much larger list of words, but we highlighted the ones we really wanted to be intentional in the first read, the page, and here you can see the element of PAT, point, act, tell. And then we thought about after reading questions and how we would maintain the thread of the story, where we would be looking at summarizing, detailing. The second read, we followed a similar structure of how we would introduce questions, how would we engage them as a connection from a first to second read, looking at the vocabulary words again, looking at extensions, clarifications. And then on the third read, we even built out even more work with vocabulary words and ideas that we would support. So I do hope that I gave you a short but supportive way to looking at the joy and the power of developing read alouds.